Welcome back. In part 2, my conversation with Jenny goes in a direction that I had not really anticipated, but was very happy to let organically unfold. Jenny begins by talking about the contemporary pagan practices and traditional Irish views about Samhain or Halloween, but from there we talk rather in depth about the complex relationship between the dead and the good people, otherwise known as fairies, whether they like humans or not, and how the ideas about the good people are tied up in Irish culture that has had a difficult past, especially due to the influence of Catholicism, and how new narratives are emerging due to contemporary pagan efforts. Okay, so moving on to my next question. This is more coming back to Halloween or Samhain as a festival, a nature-based festival. Could you talk more about how nature cycles play a role in the way people view death, or even a symbolic death? And you mentioned before about particular places that briefly mentioned. So could you talk also about particular places that hold special significance? And then just to be clear for the listeners, in this question, I'm more asking if you could be talking about the pagan ideas about death and nature in this context.
Contemporary pagan views on death generally, you have the cycle of life, so death and decay are part of that. Mm-hmm. I suppose death positive, is that right. Is that the right term? It's not seen as something scary or separate mm-hmm. from us, because for many pagan practitioners, there are part of the practices would be to communicate with the dead, right. As well as remembering and commemorating ancestors. So sometimes there's a distinction between ancestors as the collective of people who have gone before us on the planet, mm-hmm. the community of ancestors, or maybe, depending on someone's lineage, they're the whole line right back to the distant past, so Celtic or whatever it might be. So that might be what ancestor means. But there's also at Samhain, it's a time to remember the dead, so dead relatives and friends, and to maybe, for some pagans, there's a practice of sending a message, maybe by writing it on a piece of paper and burning it. So fire is very significant at Samhain, and it's also one of the magical elements for pagan practices, at least the types that I research. So earth, air, fire and water are the elements, that compose existence. So connecting with ancient philosophy, many esoteric traditions have these elements, and then the pentagram represents those elements plus ether or spirit, and each element has a correspondence with the directions, so the compass points. Sometimes in Wicca, for example, there would be magical beings that are associated with each element, and part of the ritual, most rituals have a similar basic format where a circle is cast. So cast is a technical term. It's either marked out on the ground or visualized, and the sacred space or the magical circle is where the ritual is conducted. So it's both to do with raising energy so that it's encapsulated in this magical space before it's sent out for the particular purpose, but also it's a safe space. So there's also the circle as where the ritual is performed, but it keeps out any malevolent forces or spirits or so I was talking about communicating with the dead. So some of the rituals particularly at Samhain, would be to communicate with the dead, or maybe particular deities are invoked. So invocation, kind of slightly different meanings. So some practitioners I've spoken to, they don't like to say invocation because they see it as a demand, or calling up a deity. They invite the deity to be present, or the dead or fairies. In contemporary pagan culture, there is a connection with the meaning of the festival in ancient times. So we know from, it is speculation because we don't know exactly what the Celtic peoples would have, what their view would have been, because we don't have any extant records from them. Only a few things that were written about them, and then the archaeological and literary references that we have. But it's thought that the Celtic people divided the year into a bright half and a dark half. So the dark half begins at Samhain and ends at Bealtaine, or the 1st of May. So Bealtaine in Irish traditional celebration, in the vernacular folk religion, it's the traditional start of summer, Bealtaine, and then Samhain is the traditional start of winter. And so for the ancient festival, Samhain would have been the start of the new yearly round. But as Professor Ronald Hutton has pointed out, there isn't enough evidence to say that Samhain would have been the new year for the Celtic peoples in the way that we understand the new year today. So sometimes pagans talk about it being the new year. This is more the beginning of a new yearly round. So you have the symbolic death of the old year and the start of a new cycle. So some of the historical customs in Ireland reflect that idea, because it's the time to settle debts, to kind of use up what you have. So it seems to be coming to the end of something and starting anew. And so there is a connection with that idea of a new cycle that we're beginning in contemporary pagan practices. And there's also the association with death that in Irish history, not so much nowadays, but Samhain would have been the time for farmers to decide which animals they were going to slaughter and which they were going to keep through the winter. So they'd have to have enough feed in store and so on. So you also have that association with death. And then you have the association with death of the returning dead. So in the contemporary pagan practices are always associated with the ancient festival, even though it's maybe not the same practice. So the ideas are coming from what we know about the ancient festival. And there is a reference in the Irish mythology to the she opening up at Samhain. So this word she has 3 different but interrelated meanings. So it can mean I'm going to say fairies interchangeably. So it can mean the fairies themselves, the fairy beings, she, as a collective. It can mean the mounds on the landscape, and it can mean the quality of life in the other world. So Síochána is peace, and we still have this meaning today in the language. So our police force in Ireland are called An Garda Síochána, so literally guardians of the peace. So the other world, the fairy world, is described as being a very beautiful, bright place, a bright paradise where there's no sickness and no old age. So there's those associations. And I mentioned the mounds on the landscape. So we have in the mythology, the reference is likely to places like Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. There's Newgrange, and the Boyne River associated with the goddess Boann. So Bo is cow, and so she's described as a cow goddess. And again, we have this very strong association with the divine feminine, with rivers. So almost every river has some association with a goddess. So the Shannon is Shannon, the goddess. Shannon is one of the Tuatha De Danann that I mentioned earlier. So Newgrange is it's a site that's aligned to the rays of the rising sun on the winter solstice. But it's also, like, especially viewed from the air, these sites are mounds. So they're like inside a mound. And similarly, the Hill of Tara in County Meath is a series of mounds. So there are structures within the mounds. And these sites, like Tara, Newgrange, and there's megalithic monuments like stone circles, standing stones. They're associated with the Celtic times and with, we say Celtic mythology, but these are pre-Celtic sites. Nobody knows who built them. It seems like they had some significance for Celtic peoples because you have all of these traditions which continued on, and it's problematic actually calling Irish culture, Irish mythology Celtic, because you have all of these references to pre-Celtic mythical peoples as well. But the she can also mean these mounds. So there's, just to briefly tell you, in the Irish mythology, there's different groups of mythical invaders, they're called, and different peoples who rule Ireland. And the final one, or the final group that come to Ireland, are known as the Milesians, or the Mil Hispania is their leader, Hispania being Spain. They come from Spain, and they battle with the Tuatha De Danann. So the Tuatha De Danann, people of the goddess Anu, who become associated with the fairies. And the Milesians defeat the Tuatha De Danann at the battle. They've a battle of Mortora, and they drive the Tuatha De Danann into the landscape. So there's this idea that the Tuatha De Danann's descendants are the fairies that live inside the earth in this chthonic realm and under the ground, this dark underground realm through caves, accessible through caves and particular rocks and these mounds. So the people of the Hollow Hills are what the Tuatha De Danann become known as. Where I'm going with this is that the mounds opening up at Samhain is a way of saying that the other world is coming out basically into the human realm, and that the dead and also other spirits, fairies, are intermingling with human beings, and there is a connection between fairies and the dead. So it may be that the she are ancestor spirits. So nobody knows this. Nobody knows, what precisely these things mean, because much information has been lost, and also because of the compilation of the pagan mythology or religion by Christian scribes. So things were also changed and omitted, and so there's many kind of barriers to understanding. And also the language, Old Irish is a dead language, and we have a very problematic history with the Irish language because it was literally beaten out of the people during colonization, and then people sometimes there's quite a strange relationship or attitude with Irish. So most Irish people, they're not native speakers, they might not understand much Irish, so there's a lot of different filters, but also different barriers to understanding the meaning. You were asking about death, so that's where we get this association between Samhain and the returning dead, that they're coming from the other world at this time. And there's historical traditions in Ireland that continued until the last generation or two in some regions, and it has regional variation as well. But there seemed culturally, there seems to be a much more welcoming attitude to the dead. It doesn't seem to have been a scary thing, because people would leave their doors unlatched. They would set a place in some parts of Ireland for the dead, or even leave out a meal overnight. So it's thought that this is where the custom of guising comes from, dressing up as ghosts, either to disguise oneself, or other spirits and things, disguise oneself from the dead, or maybe to welcome them or acknowledge. So nobody knows, nobody knows the exact reasons, because these are traditions. People do things because they're traditional, and we often don't know why. But there is a connection with the dead being around at this time. So this comes into contemporary paganism then, but it's more the difference, I suppose, the main difference between the traditional celebration or acknowledgement of the dead would be that contemporary pagans deliberately or consciously try to talk to the dead or communicate with the dead in a way that's not praying. It's not it's through ritual or that contact with the spirit, that deliberate contact. I would add that the way sometimes I think there's more, and this is my opinion, more feeling that I have about the folklore record, that there's more emphasis on maybe, or more people have more interest in things that are maybe scary, like changelings, fairies being put in place of humans, or things like that, rather than, there are many positive associations with the other world, like healing, and fairies are associated with very positive things as well. Just to make that point, that it's not that it's just contemporary pagans who would be having a more embracing attitude toward the spiritual realm. We don't really know further back in time in Ireland how it would have been. So I think the way that folklore material has been collected has maybe skewed that a bit, because obviously these things were collected when the country is a Catholic country, and people have their understanding of things, and we will always interpret things according to our own worldview. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we don't know how people further back in time in Ireland would have been, what their attitude would have been toward the spiritual realm. I think a lot of the fear and the idea of this dichotomy of black and white magic, or the black arts, and like even black coloured animals, like the black cat being the witch's familiar. All of these ideas are much later in time, coming from the witch trials, coming from Catholic or Christian ideas generally. This division between darkness and light. So Tirnanog is one of the names for the other world. So Tir is country, or land, and Og is young, so it's translated as land of eternal youth. There are other names for the other world as well, like Tir Tornagara, or land of promise, but it's sometimes described as a bright paradise in this literature, this early Irish literature. So we don't know if that was the Christian scribes who were writing it, their influence about heaven, or not. So we don't know if that was there. But in Christianity, there's this dichotomy between darkness, so the darkness of hell, and the association with hell being below us, also influences the traditional understanding of the other world being in the landscape or below us, through caves, through dark tunnels. And this becomes reinterpreted. And in Christianity, light and brightness is associated with heavenly forces. Jesus is the light of the world, halos, and that's a very different cosmology to the ancient or indigenous religious ideas. And so by the time contemporary pagans are reconnecting with things, there's been a lot of changed meanings already. So, for example, I mentioned the Morrigan, and there's a place known as the Morrigan's Cave in Rathcruchan, or Cruachan, in Roscommon, and there's basically a hole in the ground. But it's known as the Morrigan's Cave, and you can go into it, and it's associated with Samhain. But another name for the cave, it's known as Awi Nagat, or Cave of the Cats, because it's mentioned in the mythological story about Brickrew's feast, where there's these giant cats come out of the cave. But it's also known as Hell's Mouth. And then there's another cave that's on Loch Derg Island, associated with St. Patrick, and it's became known as St. Patrick's Purgatory, or the entranceway to hell. So one is Hell's Mouth and one is Hell's Gate, so I might be mixing them up. The reason I'm mentioning this is the Otherworld is associated with being, in Irish tradition, under the ground or in the landscape somehow, as being some connection with caves. And, that's then given a very different meaning as something evil or demonic or hell-like.
Right.
So, yeah, I think I've gone off in a tangent because I've forgotten what you asked me.
It's not a problem. That's not a problem at all. I think it's so complex. It's difficult to explain it in just a very simple fashion, because there's all these different threads that are interwoven into these notions, these either whether it be a folk belief or a more spiritual belief. But for what I hope I'm understanding correctly and gleaning from what you're saying is that because we don't know for certain how ancient people viewed the fairies or the dead, because we don't know, and because there is a possibility of Christian clerics reinterpreting things to fit their narrative, it does make everything a little bit convoluted, I guess you could say. So it's difficult to know that did everyone fear the fae or the fairies in the past, and now it's changed to a more positive attitude towards fairies, which seems, on the surface may seem to fit. But then when you come with all of these examples, you really start to realize, oh, wait a minute, this is much more complex and intertwined, and it's very difficult to separate all of those threads once they've been so tightly interwoven as in a tapestry or something like that, that there's this complete picture. Because you mentioned that in your article about ancestors, remembrance of the ancestors, that the ideas about fairies and the dead are intermingled in a way. People are associating the two as if it's the same place that they live or reside, I guess I should say. But that's not even clear. So yeah, it's just kind of this, complex web, I guess. And it depends on, your own personal perspective, I suppose, and how you were raised, and the mythologies that you've learned about growing up, and that is all influencing how you're viewing things. But you did say that generally speaking, the pagan viewpoints now have shifted somewhat to be more positive towards fairies and towards the dead in this case. But I found that to be really a very interesting discussion there, because I didn't even most of the times I'm not thinking about anything, in such detail as you're describing it. But I didn't make this link that the dead might be underground with the fairies and that would be a reason when that mound opens at Samhain, when the veil is thin, as they say, that this traffic going back and forth is very easy. it didn't dawn on me that the dead could be, that the dead go to this place as well. So I found that all to be very, very interesting. And again, please read the articles because it gives you a really good explanation of what's going on here. So please don't apologize for going off on a tangent because it's so difficult to try to keep it such a little straight and narrow little path. But thank you for explaining that, because I think this just adds to the richness of all of this material. I think with the mainstream ideas about Halloween, it's very black and white. It's all about scary things, and and it's, there's no nuance there. So I really appreciate you explaining this in more detail, and then of course highlighting how difficult it is to really talk about it, because it's so jumbled and mixed together with so many other different cultures as well that are coming into the area and also influencing things. So thank you.
I was thinking, if you said to a child or anyone really now that the dead are going to come back tonight into the house, I think for most people that's like, it's really creepy.
Yeah.
It's not really the norm in our way of understanding.
Right.
And I think to put it in a very basic way, in Christian, this might be just the difference, that in Christian cosmology, if you die, hopefully you're going to go to heaven.
Mm-hmm.
You don't come back.
Right.
You don't come back at a certain time of year. So this is a very different cosmology, way of understanding
exactly
the world. And that could be this is something that meshed together, but that people, we don't know how people would have reconciled this in the past when they would have been, I'm talking about like when, the folklore collections, where people were telling stories, for example, that there's a very common kind of experience in some of the legends where somebody goes to a ring fort or fairy fort, as they're known, and they either fall asleep or they somehow they're brought there maybe. The stories of people being brought into the other world with the fairies, and there's a dead relative in there who tells them not to eat the food because the fairy food is not food as we know it, and the person could be incorporated somehow into the she by eating this and be trapped there. So like we have these stories that have been passed down, but the people who told the stories were not asked for like context or like, what do you think of this story? Or, we don't know, how did they reconcile heaven and the other world? Or we don't really have that. And it's still a huge jump, obviously, from, medieval times when the mythology was written down. And then in medieval times, that pagan world was already gone. So there's so much that's missing. But a dead person in the other world, I mean, on the one hand, you have the other world being described as this bright, beautiful paradise, wonderful place where people are partying and singing and dancing, and where people don't get sick and they don't age. But then on the other hand, you've so many stories and fears of being taken there or being trapped there. So is it the world of the dead? Is it because it's not your time to be there? So we don't know.
No. I do recall reading stories about how the fairies don't like humans and they want to make our lives difficult, I guess you could say, in very general terms. Is that an actual folk belief, or is that just something that I've read in a book that an author has just made up?
I would say more that fairies, what the stories and when I say story, I mean legends that have been passed down. I don't mean it in a dismissive way. I would also include like what we call belief narratives, where people have had an experience, some of the stories that have been passed on that have happened to people. And that's part of my research, to collect experiences.
Right.
But a lot of what's coming out of those legends and encounters is that there's vengeance or retribution at humans who interfere with so-called fairy places. So these ring forts or fairy forts that I mentioned, which are archaeological remains, that they're circular. Some of them are still mounds. Some have been flattened out, and they can have 2 banks and ditches or 3, and they can be made of stone. So there's different kinds of ones, and some date back to the early Christian period. Some are much older, late Bronze Age. These are part of the mounds, as the people of the mounds. So they're associated with being fairy habitations or entranceways to the otherworld. So there's many legends and experiences that people have had at these places, and negative things happening when they're dug up. So these are now a protected monument, but even before they were protected by the state, these were, they're the most well preserved because of this association with the otherworld.
Yeah.
And there's also fairy trees or hawthorn. So the cutting down hawthorn is also associated with something bad happening. Right. So someone getting sick or dying, or having very bad luck. So in that way, the fairies, don't like human interference with their places. Or there's stories that were collected by Lady Gregory, for example, one of the Irish literary revival writers who was also a folklore collector. She collected stories about a boulder that fairy beings were living in, that had been moved, or something was built on their path. The house was built on the path, and a fairy person calls to the house and says, that they were living in this boulder, and it's, the people in the house, someone had died, or there was something in that story, like the woman who lived in the house said, if only we had known that this boulder was your home. So yeah. What I'm going to say now is very speculative, because we also don't know this to be true. But it's, if we can imagine in ancient times, if people had an animistic understanding of the world, that there's a boulder is not just a boulder; it's something else as well, or it's part of another world. So we tend to separate things out now into 2 worlds: there's the human realm and there's the other world. Yeah. So this is also part of our understanding now, that there's two different. One is spiritual, one is not, or but this might not have been an ancient understanding either. It could be interconnected in a way that we are not understanding now. So some of those traditions are to do with, like, maybe an animistic, there's a rock is something else as well, or
right.
There's some connection that is not perceptible to our, at least not to our mindset.
To a modern quote unquote product of the Enlightenment, using rational logic, you're not going to be thinking that the rock or the boulder is something other than what you perceive it to be. It's what the lore, if you like, is reflecting is more that these otherworld people, sometimes a problem arises because the nexus point, or the meeting place between their world and ours, what we are perceiving, something is going wrong. So it's being caused by humans. So there's also a tradition that there's these fairy or ring forts, and
there are paths or routes between them, that are routes that the fairies take, particularly at certain times of year. So those being interrupted by building on them is also something that is a reason that's given for fairy aggression. So what I'm trying to say is that the legends and people's encounters, it seems to be that the kind of message that's being communicated through that is that the fairy, these otherworld people, that they're like human beings really in their behavior, that there's some reason that they are vengeful or they do something to humans rather than being evil spirits,
right.
You know, in nature. So it seems to be that it's an otherworldly community that is sharing the same landscape. Yeah.
I think that probably is also, I'm just assuming this here. I'll just ask you. Maybe that would be better to ask instead of assume. But is it generally accepted in Ireland that fairies are real? I mean, I've read other articles about the way people in Iceland believe about elves, that it's just stated as a matter of fact that these entities are real. And for someone coming from a different country, say, Americans that aren't indigenous, who have their own culture and traditions, but other, Europeans who had transplanted to America, that this is just crazy talk. How can you think that something like this is real? So I think depending on where you're living and where you're growing up. So I was just curious to know if it is generally accepted that fairies are real in Irish culture and society.
It's a very complicated,
tricky
question. So, just simply because we can never say what people believe or what they think is real. But I think I've done some small scale ethnographic research in Iceland as well. And there are many parallels between the Huldufolk, or hidden people, and the other crowd, or the fairies in Ireland. And like, as I mentioned, living in rocks, and there's many elf rocks. So this is a similar tradition. So I would say that it's very similar in Ireland, in the culture generally. It's there. It's most Irish people in Ireland, whether you're Irish or not. Like if you've lived in Ireland, I think you would have come across this concept at least. So it's very much there with the fairy trees, and there's still hawthorn trees that are left alone. And, people, you have this word superstition, or, and there are people who would leave it alone just in case right. It might bring you bad luck. Right. So, it might not be like an overt, I believe in this, but it's culturally, it's still there in the fabric of the way people live. And people tend to associate these things with rural locations, or, particularly the west of Ireland. And that's to do with, largely to do with folklore collection and ideas about what places were rich in folklore. But I found that in urban locations, people also are aware of these things. I think the difference with Iceland, because when I was doing my research, people were very open and willing to speak about elves and Huldufolk and bring me to places associated with them. And similarly in Newfoundland, Canada, the traditions are very similar to Ireland, because it was Irish emigration there, but also from different parts of Britain. So there's a mixture of different fairy lore there. But in Newfoundland, I found people really open as well and telling me about their experiences, their encounters with fairies and so on. In Ireland, it's the same situation with the stories being there, but I find that people tell me, like, even when I'm not doing research, like, people have told me anecdotally about things before I started doing research. That's what, inspired me to begin documenting this, because people were telling me about, some neighbor that they did something on the ring fort, they moved something, or they didn't know. Then this is a long time ago. So now most people are aware that these are protected monuments. But someone told me that, this is very vague, I know, but that a neighbour had dug up a part of the ring fort and somebody in their family had died. So, this is there it's like out there in the culture, whether people say they believe in it or not, because Ireland, and this is just my opinion, I don't really there's no way of really showing this, but my opinion is that with the different cultural processes here in Ireland, with colonisation, with many aspects of Irish culture being denigrated, with the language being efforts at least to get rid of the language, really, that disconnection people have with the native language. So I mean native language, not even just as your mother tongue, but as the names in the landscape, like place names that are connected to the spiritual world, names for spiritual beings. So this is a disconnection. And also things that have happened in Irish history, like in 1895, in March 1895, there was a woman, Bridget Cleary, who was burned alive in the accusation that she was a changeling, a fairy changeling. So, there's many different things that have impacted on how Irish people view their own culture. So there's this weird kind of cultural shame here to do with fairies, especially. This also this Christianization and the different, especially Roman Catholic, very particular understanding of the spirit world as something you're not supposed to engage with, or you can pray to saints or God, you can have devotions to the Virgin Mary, but anything else is understood as demonic or something very bad. So that causes a lot of conflict. If people start to think, well, what are fairies? So it's very complex. So what I'm trying to say, that it's there in Irish culture, and I think that this is real, for many people, I would say, based on my research, but people are not so willing to openly talk about it. Like, that's something I've found a lot. People will talk away to me about fairies, and it's unlucky to say the word fairy, but I've been okay so far.
I didn't know that either. What are you supposed to say?
The other people.
That people. Okay.
The like Nadina Uashla, the noble people.
Okay.
The good people, Nadina Maha, or the wee folk, the little people, or just the other crowd.
Yeah.
So there's lots of coded ways of
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were trying to finish your thought. I'm sorry. I just was curious. But you were saying that people were very keen to talk to you about their experiences, and then I interrupted you. So
when it comes to recording it, especially on camera, people are a bit wary of that, and I think it's there's different reasons. I mean, generally speaking, like not everybody in the Irish media like is the same, but some journalists are very respectful of these traditions, and I would say most academics are very respectful. There are some who are not when it comes to intangible cultural heritage, like legends or especially traditions to do with fairies. They really make fun of this or approach it always as a lighthearted thing that's kind of silly, and that really influences people in talking about it then, so I always use the example of apparitions of the Virgin Mary, and how that was approached. We had a case of moving statues in Ballinspittle in West Cork in the 1980s, and I've never come across any media derision of that because it's Catholic. So we can't not that it's the role of academics to prove or disprove something, but I mean beliefs and traditions they're on a par. There's nobody knows the answers.
Right.
So Roman Catholic influence in Ireland, of course, has also influenced academic study, because people are always informed by their own views, and religion for many people is a deeply held, it underlies everything that they understand. So, that we also have to bear that in mind, even with folklore collection or archaeology or whatever. So it's, I think that's all of those things are influencing how people, their attitude toward fairy or otherworldly things.
With regard to this Christian context of putting otherworldly or magical entities or objects into this category of evil or damned, or do you feel that in your research with differing pagan beliefs that this is starting to shift? Are there narratives coming forth that are trying to be more positive about these notions of even witches or magic, or even just the idea of, I guess, the larger context to bring it back to what we were talking about, death and the dead? There are a lot of, when I was thinking about, different types of questions that I could ask you, I was thinking that the Christian context has really influenced to a great deal about how Westerners, I guess you could say, perhaps think about, how do we treat dead bodies? How do we deal with infections, blood, all of these different things that are associated with death, disease, but also with, if you get yourself caught up in these quote unquote occult practices, then you're going to, be damned and you're going to go to hell. And, all of these narratives surrounding, everything that's considered dark, black, evil, all these different adjectives that you could use. Are you finding now that the pagans are wanting to try to shift that paradigm and trying to change things in a more positive way? I guess positive maybe is not real. I don't know if that's the right word or not, but do you understand what I'm getting at? That they're trying to shift the narrative, the paradigm?
Yeah, I think part of that is self-identifying as a witch, or a druid, or shaman, or in the modern day when particularly the word witch has all of these negative cultural associations. I find that in Ireland there's connection with the traditional wise woman, or ban fasa, which means literally wise woman, or knowledge. Fis is knowledge. So it's more the rituals and practices would include, for most practitioners, things like healing and rituals to mark different stages and different special times. So that's even practicing that is changing the narrative, as I said.
Yeah.
It's changing what people understand by the word witch. And I mentioned druids, in Ireland, the word for magic is druicht, so it's literally druidry. So I find that in a general sense, people usually know, if they're not familiar with paganism, they usually know what you mean by druid. They have some idea of what druid means, or what a druid might do, that it has something to do with nature and being out in the forest and things like that.
Yeah.
Whereas the word witch, I found, like, when people ask about my research, if they're not familiar with paganism, they might react to the word witch, and then I have to explain that it's not, as it has taken on that meaning in many different cultures, that it's the witch is the one who is an evildoer, or does the hexing, or then you go to someone else to lift that curse or whatever. So the witch figure has so many negative cultural associations, so many different contexts. So, like, you have the biblical passage that's translated, at least, as thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. Yeah. Leviticus is it, and the kind of witch as a scapegoat for disease, like you mentioned, disease or crops failing, all of those ideas, or witches sacrificing babies and harming people. And then you have all of the witch trial ideas that come out of that whole time period, and it all mixes together. So, like, I think taking back the word witch, or not really taking it back, but taking it and transforming it into a different meaning, as like a religious self-identification, and as a practice. And I found, there are other kinds of witches who are not pagan. So it's important to mention that as well. But in paganism, I found that there isn't this distinction between, if you've heard white witches, this is more in what I would call New Age.
Yeah.
But it's the good or bad magic is more the intent,
right,
rather than a force. So yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it said, energy is energy.
Yeah.
It's not good or bad. It's just what it is. You use it for whatever purpose or intention. So yeah, I've heard that too.
You can use electricity to light the house, or you can electrocute someone until they die,
Yeah.
Not the electricity. Well, it is the electricity that's doing it, but it doesn't have its own agency.
Exactly.
It's so that the person is directing it. Yeah.
That's right. Right. Well, in closing, I wanted to ask if there was anything that we haven't touched upon that you think would be important to this conversation.
I think it's important to highlight that nobody owns these ancient sites on the landscape. I know technically they might be, in the care of the state or something, but I mean, nobody today can lay claim on those sites. Nobody owns traditions. It's something that has it's been created from people generally. And I find there's a lot of attempts by media and sometimes by academics, not so much, but sometimes you come across a very dismissive attitude toward some new religious movements, including paganism. I would say especially paganism, and also the academics who research paganism. Sometimes there's an effort to kind of to be dismissive of the research, like with ethnographic research. Just anecdotally, I've been asked so many times whether I'm pagan or what religion am I, and I find that interesting because my colleagues in study of religions, they're not asked if they're Christian when they research Christianity, or if they're Muslim researching Islam. This is not a problem; it's expected, and I find people are not asking out of interest. They don't even really want to know the answer. It's just a way of saying, well, the data is not really, they're trying to categorize this in a different way to anything else that someone might research, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I also find a lot of resistance within academia to ethnographic research on fairy lore in particular, like when it's to do with experiences and things that are happening now, people's understandings of those experiences. Because I've like folklore as a discipline, because I used to be in a folklore department, and my PhD was in folklore and ethnology. But the focus, very generally speaking, in that discipline has been on storytelling traditions, stories as entertainment, and there's kind of a separation of people who study mythology through Celtic civilization, Celtic studies. They study the languages, the texts, and then there's a different group of scholars who are folklorists and looking at traditions in later time periods. And when you try to connect the strands, so I'm aware that the traditions do not, it's not possible to kind of take a tradition and connect it directly to ancient times, but these traditions came from somewhere. So there are strands of things, when you connect them in relation to fairy lore, because that's one of the main things that I research. I found a lot of resistance to that within academia, and I'm not sure of if it's something to do with religion or something disciplinary, but it's kind of, I've just noticed it.
Curious. Is this perhaps, do you feel perhaps that it's coming from this idea that fairies are put into the category of like stories that are fiction, that it could not be potentially a real thing, or a real quote unquote real experience that someone could have?
I think that's part of it, describing these kinds of things as vernacular religion. There's people maybe expect you to talk about popular Catholic traditions, but of course the popular Catholicism contains these so-called pagan elements. Right. So, it's the fairy lore is part of that. So yeah, there's a lot less studies of the fairy lore in that kind of context when you compare it to something like Marian devotions, the Virgin Mary prayers and folk prayers even. There's a very different prevailing attitude.
Yeah, I've always found that very interesting with regard to my own research into otherkin. People have asked me, "Well, are you otherkin?" No, but why are you? That's not important. Why are you even asking me this question? It's, to me, I found not so much from my professors. Luckily, they were all very, very open to the idea of looking into phenomena that, of course, this is all qualitative, and what you're doing is also qualitative, ethnographic, participant-based, observational, that type of research where you're trying to really understand the experiences of another person or other people. They're very, very open to that. But I do get, sometimes people think, as if like put it on the same level as if I were studying a comic book hero character as being quote unquote real. But in this context, that could be the case. It could be real. So it's this, I guess it is kind of a shift in perspective of what are people telling you? What are people telling you about their lives? What are people telling you about their identities? Their the things that they can't explain in any other way. They can't say, well, I dreamt it, or I hallucinated it, or there's, of course, people like to put those types of explanations on top of it. But I think there is a lacking of space for this type of research in general, and perhaps that's what you're feeling as well, that in academia, that they don't really want to give you that space to be able to ask these questions in the sense of we're doing legitimate research here. This isn't just some fluff piece that you're working on. This is serious research. I don't know if this resonates with you or not.
Yes. I mean, I often think of the interpretation as well in different cultural contexts, like an apparition of the Virgin Mary. I know I keep going back to that example, but it's a valid it's very point. Like, it's familiar, even if you're not Catholic, it's a familiar idea that people have seen apparitions of the Virgin Mary. But if someone says they saw an apparition of the goddess Ishtar, people are like, the kind of psychiatric labels as well of
definitely
being schizophrenic or hearing voices, seeing visions. Yeah. This is understood very differently to an apparition of the Virgin Mary. And that's a cultural thing. That's
excellent point.
That's part of the resistance. Even it might not be specifically religious, but it's like the underlying general cultural assumptions that people make, or the familiarity of something, I suppose. And I think part of what I research in, new religious movements and the occult, people are afraid of the word occult, or even like someone practicing magic. This is not usual for people generally in the population. So I think a lot of it is cultural fears. Sure. And this is also why it's on the margins of academia, because academic life, it's not separate from the world. We're academics are people, and right. we're from a particular culture and time period. So, yeah,
definitely. Well, I think that with the type of work that you're doing, the research that you're doing, I think it's important, and I think that more and more people doing this type of research will, hopefully, in any case, it will hopefully start to create this space where it's seen as a legitimate type of research. I know there are differing attitudes about it, but I think it's important. So well done to you for what you're doing. I think it's great work that you're doing. And I just want to thank you for sharing all of this with me today, for taking time out of your day to talk to me about all of this in the context of death and different ways of looking at it, and not being so frightened of it, I guess. So thanks for that.
You're welcome. And it's been very nice to chat with you.
My deepest thanks to Dr. Jenny Butler for sharing her knowledge with us all. As I stated in the interview, I really recommend reading her work, should you be interested in this topic, as Jenny offers so much more information in that material. Check out the other reference material as well that Jenny mentioned in our discussion in the program notes. And of course, questions are always welcome. If you are enjoying the content I am providing, I'd greatly appreciate it if you would leave a positive review and rate the podcast, and leave a like on YouTube if you listen there. It really helps the podcast get noticed. I have a new spotlight in the works, this time about Arthur Edward Waite and his notion of a secret tradition. That too will be uploaded to Simplecast in an audio version. I am still working on getting the other older spotlights uploaded and appreciate your continued patience. Okay, that's all from me this time. As always, thanks for listening.